Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. Today we are reviewing Eliza Part 1. Yes, you heard that correctly. I am doing a new format of these character reviews where I'm breaking them up into smaller segments for three reasons. Number one, to make it more digestible for you, the viewers, so you can watch a faster video. Number two, for me, so I can cut down on the total editing and recording time I have to do. And then, more importantly, number three, it's to make sure that I don't jump the gun on some of the analysis, where there are some things we can tell about a character ahead of time and some things that we really need to see with our own eyes and test in game before we can make an accurate assessment, because there's always mistranslations on WOTV calc, things that don't get data mined correctly, questions on the AI prioritization, and I think it's disingenuous to keep doing reviews when we don't actually know those things for a fact. So for today, I'm at least going to go over the things that we do know. So the character overview, the stat analysis, and the report card. But overall, Eliza, brand new ICE unit. They gave her the unique new job of Hunter, while also giving her Trick Lancer, which was another very unique job only available to Winter Luartha. They also have the Ranger sub-job there as well. She can equip bows and hats, cloth, and accessory with a move of 3 and a jump of 2. That extra jump is very noteworthy. We'll get to that later. From a resistance standpoint, though, minus 10% to magic and minus 5% to pierce. The magic one is one you'll probably want to look out for, but you would hopefully stay out of range a little bit, that it's not all that impactful, because the other resistances are pretty great in terms of double digits, for 10% to slash and strike and 15% to missile, so that makes for some nice missile duels potentially. Now from a status ailment perspective, 50% to stun and slow. It is debatable whether or not you want to have her at 97 faith or 50 faith. She does have some of her own status ailments in her kit that certainly get a higher chance to proc if she's a 97 faith unit, but if you see that minus 10% to magic and no spirit, spoiler alert for what we're going to go over soon with the HP, she does take a lot more damage from the magic, so debatable whether or not you want to have her at the 97 faith. I'll do a deep dive on that in part 2. Now for the base stat analysis, and again, this is super important when you consider that buffs scale off base stats, vision cards, trust stones. It's important to understand at least where they stand relative to other characters, but it's not the whole picture. So base stat wise, she does skew a little bit lower here. She's the green triangle that from a DPS perspective, definitely on the lower side, but that being said, from a missile unit standpoint, she's actually relatively in line with the other missile unit users, and I'm going to do a whole deep dive on that in a couple minutes here. And if you look at who her company is, you know, there's some evade units down here, but there are some other missile units. You can see Cetia, you see Lucia, some are Lilith, so she's kind of in a good spot for what her character profile typically needs to be. Now from an attack perspective, also skews on the lower side of things. She is definitely in that lower quartile, if you will, but again, relatively in line with what you'd expect from the missile units. But overall, base attack is on the lower side. That's okay though, there's other ways to make up for total damage output. I'm going to go through that in a minute here. Now from a base stat agility perspective, she does at least skew high. So when you apply those 15% agility cards to her, she will get some good benefit out of them, but that doesn't make her a speedy character. She actually ends up not being as fast as the base agility might lead you to believe. You can see she is amongst the tops here, tied for number 3 overall. But from a dexterity standpoint, she is amongst top of the charts, number 3 overall, which again, if you look at the other missile unit, she's in good company, right where she needs to be overall. From a luck perspective, skews a little bit lower, and that's fine. Her accuracy isn't terribly impacted by that. Definitely not an evade unit either, so you don't have to worry too much about the luck stat overall. And just for context, this is where she ends up being in the broad list, but really no takeaways there. But finally, when you look at the total stats, so when you can put in the base stats, her board, her mastery, she ends up at a spot that is still relatively low. She does have some board stats and board nodes that help amplify her attack a little bit, so it's not purely reliant on the base attack. She does have some nice dexterity that they give her as well on the board. And overall totals still ends up being very low on the HP side of things, which is something to absolutely keep in mind, but it's not as alarming as you might think. We're going to get into why. So the deep dive on the missile units, by and large, they typically trade off their survivability for range, where obviously if you can stay outside of the enemy range of damage, you obviously don't get hit as much, so survivability isn't as much of an issue, so you don't have to worry about the overall HP level as much. And the attack stats for the missile units tend to be diminished compared to their damage counterparts, but they do make up for it in very high dexterity stats. There's a couple reasons why. Number one, it affects the critical hit rate, where if they can hit critical hits every single time, that's an important increase in damage overall. Number two, it affects their accuracy, where if they can hit 100% of their attacks because they have such high accuracy rates, that ends up probably doing more total damage compared to a character that misses attack or two. It also affects the extra damage modifiers that are inherent in a lot of the abilities, where if you go to WOTV Calc, you'll see a lot of these abilities, they take into account a certain percentage of the attack, a certain percentage of dexterity, a certain percent of luck. And so characters with high dexterity, when you take a certain percentage of that, usually 20%, it actually does end up mitigating a little bit of the loss on the attack stat side. But finally, it also scales with unit affinities. So although you don't want them grouped up all the time with units, that's very dangerous. If they're nearby a healer that's on the back line or nearby another missile unit, they have level 5 unit affinity that affects how much dexterity they give each other. That higher dexterity will affect all of these 3 prior bullets. So overall, the attack stat, there's more to it than just that. They also do skew a little bit higher in agility, not terribly so, but just barely enough where they essentially trade, damage per attack for just an extra turn. So they end up doing still a lot of damage in the battle just by the sake of having an extra turn or two. And then finally, and this is the most important thing, missile units, regardless of the stats, regardless of anything, they're very ability and passive reliant for modifiers and range. The ability in particular, certain maps are just too small, where if they can't get the right buff order, like aimed fire and then council and things that can increase their damage output and their range, then they're not going to get nearly the value they should. So regardless of the stats, regardless of the kit, if the map is not right, they boom or bust based upon that. So these are all super important things to keep in mind, particularly when you're looking at a comparables analysis. So if we're looking at a handful of the variety of missile units here, I at least want to show you that she's not terribly far off, and she's in fact better than many when it comes to a lot of these stats, despite the fact that she doesn't stand out compared to other damage dealers in the scheme of the game. So from an HP perspective, Eliza's at 3065, right in line with many of the rest of them, right in the middle along the rest of them. The same can be said for attack, 448, right in the middle of the range between Lucia and Fred, nothing too crazy there. From an agility perspective, she comes out at 67, like I said, skews a little bit higher than some of her counterparts. From a dexterity perspective, she is amongst the highest right there with Fred. Luck perspective, right around average. The accuracy, and this does include passives, she does come out to be one of the more accurate missile units, but again, if you take that 25% accuracy passive off, it drops down to 171, which is still right in line average with the other missile units. Evasion wise, she's right there too, only Prompto being the real evade capable unit. But then we get into some more niche things that we also need to keep in mind. The missile modifier passives, between what they can potentially get up to with their mastering passives. She can get up to 27, which is kind of in line with many of the others. Same thing for what their max range potential is. She can get up to 2 extra range on the passive, which they all can also. But these last two are also critically important when you talk about damage output. Number one is the missile resistance penetration. So Fred and Cetia both have 40% missile resistance penetration potentially, while Eliza only has 20. But that's okay, because when you look at defense penetration, Fred's only at 10, CT is only at 20, and then Eliza can get up to 40. So there's much more than just the attack stat when you're considering overall damage output. But the bottom line is Eliza's not terribly far off from what missile users typically are, despite the fact that other damage dealers are usually higher when it comes to many of the other stats. And that's for obviously good reasons that we pointed out on the prior slide. Now I go through all of this context, because if I didn't, you would look at the report card and probably scratch your head at why my final grade is what it is. So when we look at effective HP, I'm giving her a D. She does have very low effective HP. She has no defense and no spirit and no passives to boost either of them. So that's extremely squishy for a unit in conjunction with the already very low health pool. She also has no access to AoE or unit resistance in her kit. She's got no courage or re-raids, which you see some of these lower HP units have for a trade-off on survivability, and no evasion to offset that low HP. So overall ends up being a D. Now from a physical HP perspective, slightly better, because we did see the 10% strength to slash and strike and 15% to missile, but magic HP, I'm actually giving her an F for the pure reason that you can't have a unit with no spirit, minus 10% magic, and low HP and not expect them to get absolutely blown away by the first sight of many of these high octane magic damage dealers. So definitely keep that in mind when building her. Now from the primary stat perspective, we already talked at length at why it doesn't really matter by itself. I'm giving her a D+. It does skew low, but we're going to see in part 2 of the review, all of her abilities trade off some of that firepower for a bunch of utility, where every single ability has something really awesome to potentially utilize. Now from an agility perspective, she ends up at a C. Despite the high base agility, she has no agility boosting passives. Her board stats, only the 4 extra agility, although good, doesn't really elevate her. She ends up sitting right at the average of units when you can equip all of their passives potentially. And then accuracy-wise, she is a B+, so she does have that 25% accuracy passive. Not always a deal to equip that though, so even if you take it off, it still doesn't take that much to make her very accurate. She does have sharpshoot, which is 100% hit chance on the ranger sub job, but that's not as great of an ability nowadays as it used to be. From an evasion standpoint, D, not an evade unit at all. From a movement perspective, I'm giving her a B because she does have access to the jump of 2, but it is a little bit of a double-edged sword. So number one, it can hurt her where a lot of maps have height, barriers that normally would stop characters from going north and south toward the enemy. And for a ranged unit, that's sometimes dangerous, where she's not going to be hindered by the map topography. She can cut through some of it. She might get closer than you would like her to be. On the other side of things, as a bow unit, elevation does help overall range. So if they have some maps where you can get to some high ground a little easier, it should help her overall range. So it's a good thing and a bad thing, really map specific. Now we get into these last 4 items. These are a little bit more of a sneak peek of what you're going to see in part 2 when I go through the abilities and what you're going to want to have on and off and how you're going to want to use them. From a passives perspective, I'm giving her a C+. They're not bad, they're just average. They're relatively ordinary compared to what many of the other units have. From a counter perspective though, giving her an A+. She has 2 absolutely out of this world fantastic counter abilities. I honestly don't know which one's better, but they're both S tier as far as I'm concerned. This should even be an A+. But the overall kit, this is where you need to start to peel the onion back a little bit when you look at a total character. I'm giving her an A+ for her overall kit. It has so much utility on the main job, so many teamfight changing things, so many unique mechanics that are unique to the hunter job, that it ends up being an A+ overall for what she does with her kit. And when you balance all of these things together, I'm ending up giving her a B+. She will be an important part of a future potential ice meta, but not necessarily meta defining on her own. There's a lot of things that still need to happen from a vision card perspective, from a unit release perspective, getting Snow and Agrias' EX upgrade. But overall, despite the lower stats, which is, not unique to a missile unit, her overall kit and what she does impact-wise to a team fight is actually very good. So I'll be getting all into that in part 2, so stay tuned for that. I do have her at level 120 right now as we speak. I did it today, so I'm going to spend the next day or so tinkering with her AI, using her in arena, getting to know her better, and that way I can give you a more thorough and accurate review on her abilities and the rest of her character kit in part 2. And then hopefully in part 3, it'll be a little more analysis on her TMR, some Esper and vision card potential, things like that that can really optimize her character, trust stones, things like that. So hopefully this new format works for you all. Hopefully it works for me too. This is obviously the first time doing it, but that's it for now. For those of you that have pulled her, have fun tinkering with her. She will be useful in the Guild Wars right now, given the map bonus for many of you. But until then, I'll talk to you all soon, and thanks for watching.